Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at nun danket, alle, Gott, which translates to now all thank God. This is a fairly straightforward chorale, not too much to say about it, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So 1 sharp in the key signature, we start on G major, we end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major. We move to F sharp, A, and D. It's D major in first inversion, or 5-6. This D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. G, B, G, and D is another tonic triad, G major. Then we get C, C, G, and E. It's a 4-chord C major in root position, passing tone in the bass, E, C, G, and E. That's just taking C major, putting it in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. This C is a chord tone, this A is a non-chord tone, but I think it's just a passing tone. I don't think Bach's implying like an A minor chord here. Regardless, this is some type of plagal cadence where we cadence on one following a, a predominant chord or a non-dominant chord. So G, D, B, and D, G major. Looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. No modulations yet, so we are still analyzing in G. So G, D, G, and B. No need to reanalyze. G, D, A, and C. Looks like there's some type of suspension going on here, and it happens to be in the lowest voice, the bass. Instead, we have F sharp, D, A, and C, which is 5-6-5, D7 over F sharp. Then we have G, D, G, and B. Sorry, G, D, D, and B. That is our tonic triad again, G major. This G is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. Seeing something very similar to what we had in our first phrase here. Then we had D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5-chord again, D major. Passing 7th in the bass, B, G, D, and B. It's our tonic triad, G major over B, so first inversion. This E is a non-chord tone, this G is a chord tone, this C is a chord tone, so we have kind of like a passing 4-chord here, but this D complicates things, so I'm not going to analyze it as a 4-chord, even though the chord's almost entirely intact. That D is a little too foreign. But regardless, we move from 1-6 to 2-6-5, C, E, E, and A. Apologies, this is an E, not a G. I always confuse my clefs. C, E, E, and A. So this is just a 2-6 chord, which we know that Bach loves in cadential situations. This F sharp is a non-chord tone. This B is a non-chord tone. This C is still a chord tone. We then have D, A, G, and A. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but this F sharp is our actual chord tone, leaving us with a 5-chord, D, A, F sharp, and A, D major. Then we cadence on G, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position, pencil lead broke. I swear the lead that I bought for this pencil has been breaking a lot recently, or is that just me? Anywho, looking ahead, we have something that kind of sounds interesting to me. I think this might be the most interesting part of the chorale. To me, it sounds like we're in the key of D major here, or some D major adjacent pitch collection, like D mixolydian or something. So maybe there's some mixolydian going on here, who knows, but ultimately I think what we have going on here is a half cadence in the key of G major, so no modulation just yet. Here we have D, A, F sharp, and A. That's our 5-chord, at least the way that I'm analyzing it. And we have passing tones in the bass and the alto before we get F sharp, D, A, and A. That's just taking our 5-chord, putting it in first inversion, neighbor tones in the same 2 voices, then F sharp, C, A, and A. That is F sharp minor, sorry, F sharp diminished, which would be, actually, you know what, I think actually what's going on here is this is not an F sharp diminished chord. If you're a literalist, yes, that's technically what's happening here, but in the grand scheme of things, I do think what's happening is Bach is just incorporating this D and this F sharp into the whole beat. So I think that this is a 7-chord in root position, so I'll just change the figured bass to reflect that, 7-5-3. because this F sharp just precedes what I think the actual root of the chord is. But 7-5-3 versus a 7 chord, I don't know. I bet 5 going to 7 really is, it's not really a progression really, because the chords function very similarly to one another and they have mostly the same tones. So I don't know whether you look at this as a 7 chord or a 5-7 chord. That's up to you, but I think it's a 5-7 chord. We then have G, B, D, and B, tonic triad, G major, passing tones in the lower voices, B, D, G, and B. That's just taking our tonic triad, putting it in first inversion. We're seeing kind of a pattern here over this chorale. Passing tone in the bass as well before we cadence on D, D, F sharp, D, D, F sharp, and A. I confuse my clefs all the time. D major, making this a half cadence like I mentioned earlier. But if you did analyze this in like some sort of like D major context, Bach almost spends the entirety of the measure avoiding C's until we get to the very end where we have these two C naturals, which makes me feel like maybe there's like a mixolydian idea here. I don't know, food for thought, but it's still analyzable in the key of G. But G major, D mixolydian, they're the same notes, just different context. But following our half cadence in the key of G, we do go to a perfect authentic cadence, or a phrase that ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D. So ultimately we're going to move to the key of D, and interestingly actually, we're not going to modulate over the D chord because we do have this C natural. And I think it would be kind of interesting to incorporate that C natural into the context of D right at the start. I think there need to be some more establishment going on. But again, we have another 5 chord here, D, D, F sharp, and A with the passing 7th in the tenor. And then we have G, B, D, and B, which is our tonic triad G major. And we have these passing tones going, or we have 2 passing tones in the upper voices in an anticipation in the tenor, but I do think this G major chord is actually where we modulate over to the key of D major. It is now our 4 chord. This A, E, and C sharp, like I just mentioned, are non-chord tones, making this an A7 chord over G, 5-4-2. And that works out because it resolves exactly where we would expect. F sharp, A, F sharp, and D, which is D major in first inversion, D major now being our tonic triad rather than our dominant triad because we're in the key of D now. This B is a non-chord tone, this D is a chord tone. It kind of gives us a little bit of a feeling of 6, but I'm not entirely sure how much that contributes to the chord progression because it looks like Bach is just doing a lot of skipping and leaping and counterpoint as we are closing in on the cadence. So I think the overall takeaway from this is we have a tonic triad. This B is going to go down to G, G, D, B, and D, which is our 4 chord like we just learned, G major. This E is a non-chord tone, this G is a non-chord tone. And actually, I might walk that back and call this a 6 chord because what Bach ends up doing here is turning the progression kind of into a series of predominants that all precede a 5 chord, because E, G, B, and D would be like a 2-7 chord. The bass is also moving, which makes this feel more progressional than anything else. And then we have A, E, A, and C sharp. Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and write them in there for the sake of caution more than anything else. Neighbor tone, little decorative neighbor tone here in the tenor, then A, E, G, and C sharp. This is a passing 7th. I'm not going to say that this is moving from 5 to 5-7, but we really have like this 6-4-2 style of progression. Really, I think 4 is sort of the anchor, like the, am I using the word fulcrum correctly if I used it in this context? It's like the central point, because 2 is very similar to 4, they share 2 tones in common, and 6 is similar to 4 because they share 2 tones in common. So I feel like on the outsides of it, the fact that they're off of the harmonic rhythm are coincidental. And yeah, they might be there, but that's sort of what's going on here with subdivided chord progressions. They're not quite as strong as chord progressions that occur on consecutive beats of the harmonic rhythm. But our perfect authentic cadence, without tarrying on for too long, ends on D major, D, D, F sharp, and D, 3 roots and 1/3. Looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, so it's kind of interesting that we go from D major to A minor, and actually, I guess even more interestingly is that we go to A minor through C major as well. We do reference G major here, but it doesn't ever, well, actually, this is something to break down a little bit. D is the dominant of G, so that resolution does sort of exist, but G immediately pivots into turning into the dominant of C major. So G major here, G, B, G, and D is our 4 chords still. See, my pencil lead is breaking like crazy. I don't know what. Maybe I need to get a different brand or something. 4 turns into 5 in the key of C major. We then have C, C, G, and E. That's our tonic triad and root position. Passing tone in the tenor, in the alto. And then we have G, D, B, and D again. That's another 5 chord in the context of C major. And then we get these F naturals. It's a passing 7th. This E is a known chord tone. This F is also a known chord tone. Then we get E, G, B, and C. And I'm pretty convinced this is a tonic triad in first inversion, but because we're closing in on a cadence, Bach is getting contrapuntal. We have this suspension here, and I suppose you could just say that this G and this E are accented non-chord tones. I think that's a valid analysis if you really do feel like F is sort of the point of arrival of this 5 chord. But I think actually what's going on here is some adjacent harmony, or not adjacent harmony. The 3 chord is actually going to spin us into a cycle of falling fifths progression that falls very nicely onto our tonic triad, or our new tonic triad, which is going to be A minor. So this C major, I do believe, is 3/6 in the key of A major, and that makes sense as well, because also in the context of A minor, or did I say C major? I meant in the key of A minor. In the context of A minor, 3/7 chords are not as bold of a statement as a tonic 7 chord would be in the key of C. So this suspension sort of gets repurposed as a 3 chord in the key of A minor, which is, like I said, not as bold of a statement. But 3 ends up going to 6 off of the harmonic rhythm. We have F, A, and C, which is F major, our 6 chord. Then we get D, F, A, and B. It's B minor 7 flat 5 over D. It's a 2/6/5 chord, so 3/6/2. That's a good progression. Normative progression. E, and G sharp are all non-chord tones, making this a root position 5 chord. E, G sharp, and B. That's E major. That's our dominant. And then we cadence on A minor. A, and C. Imperfect authentic cadence. 3/6/2/5/1. Cycle of falling fifths progression. So it's interesting that we have a mid-phrase modulation to C and then to A, but it wouldn't be as interesting as going from like C then back to G, for example, because C and A, for all intents and purposes, they share a pitch collection. They're not different until you add the leading tone. That's what contextualizes one from the other, really, or separates the two of them, makes them easier to discern in a tonal context. But looking ahead, we are getting ready for a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major to wrap up the chorale. I do think this A actually is a common chord back to the key of G. I will call it 2, and interestingly enough, we do go to a 1 chord, so in a roundabout way, this is a 2-to-1 progression, and if you've watched my videos in the past, you'll know that 2-to-1 is always a progression that is veiled in some type of mystery. Of course, take this 2-to-1 progression with a grain of salt, because it's happening at the end of one phrase and going to another phrase, so it's really not a connected progression. They're 2 separate ideas. But I do think A minor does introduce the idea of G major as well, because the chord is common between both keys. So it's not really a progression, it's just introducing the idea. It's also going to 1 in first inversion. It's just 2 going to 1, both root position. That is a chord progression I don't think that I've seen in Bach, where both chords are on the harmonic rhythm. It's there's always an excuse, but it's my tinfoil hat is on, and I'm pretty much convinced that that is a progression that Bach is averse to using. But moving ahead, this G is a chord tone. It's like putting the chord in root position, so we'll just put that there. D, F sharp, D, and A is our 5 chord, D major, and that interestingly gets turned into first inversion over this beat, or this 8th note, F sharp, D, D, and A, and it's entirely intact. That's pretty interesting that we have a series of 2 chords that does that. It's pretty uncommon for the inversion of the chord on the subdivision to not take away from the intactness of the chord. Typically when you move one of the notes, it leaves, the 5th is missing or the 3rd is gone, but in both of these cases we have an entirely intact chord, and that's pretty neat. Afterwards we have G, B, D, and B, tonic triad again. This C is a non-chord tone, this A is a non-chord tone, E, C, they're all non-chord tones. This gives us A minor in first inversion, 2-6, probably indicates that we're headed towards some type of cadence, which we are. We then have D, A, D, and A. Kind of an interesting chord here. I suppose you could analyze this as an open 5th. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think this A and this D are accented non-chord. Actually, this D would be a chord. Wait, hold on. Just realized that analysis would not make sense if I analyzed it that way. If we have D, B, G, and A, I had this analyzed as a 1-6-4 chord in my notes. That is not the case. So what is going on here? I guess this is an open 5th. Yeah, and these are all just non-chord tones, so we're hinting at the idea of like a 1-6-4 chord here, but we have an open 5th for a very brief period of time here that resolves in an interesting fashion. The G resolves down to F sharp, but the gesture is introduced with this D here, so D goes up to F sharp. Kind of interesting, but 5 turns into 5-7, D, C, F sharp, and A. So we'll just change the figured bass there. This G is an anticipation. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, tonic triad, root, position. Interesting ending there. I had it in my notes that this was a 1-6-4 chord, and this B and this G, and for all intents and purposes it is. We could look at this A like a suspension and have this G be its point it's like its destination, right? But I guess really what is being implied here is a 5 chord that hasn't fully crystallized yet, and we have to wait to the next beat in order to see it its entirety. But other than that, that's pretty much all I have to say about the chorale. Maybe a little hint at modality here, kind of a very gentle hint. It's not very strongly enforced like some of the other chorales that we see modality in. It's relatively uncommon to see modality in Bach, but sometimes it sneaks up, and that's interesting. We get some distant modulation as well from D directly to C, but it's smoothed over by the fact that a common chord is being used and it's being preceded by its own dominant, so it's about as smooth of a distant modulation as you can achieve, I think, in theory. So that's pretty cool that Bach does that. And other than that, fairly straightforward. We get a plagal cadence. Those are pretty uncommon, but other than that, lots of 1s and lots of 5 chords. But on that note, if you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload. You can also like the video if you enjoyed the content, because that would mean that my video is going to be seen by more people. That means growing a bigger community, that means more discussion, and that means more analysis as well. So that's the type of thing we like around here. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.